Well, the brand names are finally talking about it now that the systemic anti-whiteism is so obvious that it's impossible to ignore, and most people are having a hard time staying silent about it because they're so disgusted with it. And of course, us YouTubers are always a decade or so ahead of the brand name political pundits, but we do have to pat them on the back and encourage them to keep doing the right thing when they finally get around to it.
Ali Mistal writes, I believe, for The Nation, and he appears on MSNBC all the time on Joy Reid's show.
He's the Q-tip looking guy, by the way.
And other programs. And Ali Mistal hates white people and has made this clear over and over and over, or at least his rhetoric suggests that he does.
Oh, no, he does. That's a fact.
He wrote an article in 2021 called...
Dr. Drew is getting nervous. Look at him. He doesn't want to admit the obvious elephant in the room, the systemic anti-whiteism.
I am not ready to re-enter white society. As a black man. As the pandemic wanes, and I have to leave the safety of my whiteness-free castle, I know that racism is going to come roaring back into my daily life, right? Because he's going to have to be around the whites again. Over the past year, I have, of course, still had to interact with white people on Zoom or television, etc. But white people aren't in my face. They're not in my face all the time. How is that any different as a material matter than what Scott Adams just said?
Well, what Scott Adams said was just a preference based on an observation and crime statistics that you're not supposed to talk about. It wasn't actually hateful like the despicable rhetoric that you just read from Ellie Mystical is.
Here is a black man intentionally limiting his exposure to white people who he doesn't want in his face all the time. He doesn't have to deal with their whiteness, except for when he wants to. He doesn't.
I guess that's our loss, right?
Find being around white people safe, and he's not ready to re-enter white society.
Well,
the same white society that keeps white kids dumb, and doing so is as American as apple pie.
I could think of a whole continent full of countries that he would probably enjoy much better than ours, but I can't say that because that would be racist.
Every night, MSNBC, no problem. Scott Adams, his career is done. He's canceled by everyone. And the double standard Adam speaks volumes.
It certainly does, and some of us have been shouting from the rooftops about it for many years. But hey, Megan, better late than never. Remember, it was just a few months ago when Tulsi Gabbard left the Democrat Party, and in her announcement explaining why, she said in part it's because of their systemic anti-whiteism.
Who divide us by racializing every issue and stoking anti-white racism.
Just 2 days ago, Matt Walsh published a video titled Anti-White Racism is Real, and just some constructive criticism, not to be picky, and this isn't an attack, but you should use the word anti-whiteism. Get it? Anti-white racism, anti-whiteism. The left knows how powerful labels and terminology and language is, and so everybody should start calling anti-white racism anti-whiteism. That's what it is. That's what it should be called. But strangely, Christopher Rufo, the self-proclaimed critical race theory expert, continues to refuse to use it, and instead continues to call it critical race theory, which is ridiculous because it sounds like it's just a theory, and 99% of critical race theory is just anti-whiteism. Of course, sadly, there's still a ton of anti-Asian racism in America, most of which is perpetuated by black people, and in the university system because they don't get accepted because of the affirmative action hires that are given priority over them despite having lower grades. And that appears to be the primary concern of Christopher Rufo, whose wife is Asian, whose children are Asian, and apparently he believes that by talking about or pointing out the systemic anti-whiteism, that's going to add fuel to white identity, which he strictly opposes, which is the idea of white people collectively identifying as an ethnic group and demanding the same rights and privileges as all of the other ethnic groups in a society. Then there's Ben Shapiro, who does finally address anti-whiteism, although he doesn't use that term, but he still couldn't help but denounce Scott Adams, the creator of the Dilbert cartoon, as being a racist.
Just to rewind for a second, Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, he said some racist stuff, which of course is indeed racist, what he said was in fact racist, you can fully acknowledge Scott Adams' racism and still also recognize that the media would be totally fine with Scott Adams' racism if it was directed in precise reverse at white people. In the United States, if you direct racism against black Americans, that of course is verboten, it's very bad, and you'll have your career ended. And there's a strong case that that ought to be the case because racism is bad.
So Ben Shapiro approves of Scott Adams being canceled for deciding to live in a neighborhood that he feels safe in and has neighbors that don't hate him because he's white. And Scott Adams' cartoon, Dilbert, now canceled completely. His syndicator canceled him. So first it was hundreds of individual papers and newspaper syndicates, but now the syndicator of the column itself, or the cartoon itself, canceled him. And his book publisher, he had a new book that was supposed to be coming out. That's done. And when his current books are out of print, they're not going to reprint them. They said that all of his past titles, also his calendars, the Dilbert calendars, gone. It is the #1 bestseller currently in the humor and comic calendars, but as soon as it's out of stock, they're not going to print anymore. The memes that have come out of this have been very interesting, to say the least. Scott Adams has become a meme for noticing certain things that you're not supposed to notice or say anything about out loud. And people are even making their own Dilbert cartoons. And this is one that I made. I'm sorry, Dilbert, but only black people are allowed to say they don't want to live in black neighborhoods. Right, Chris Rock?
Now, we got a lot of things, a lot of racism going on in the world right now. Who's more racist, black people or white people? Black people. You know why? Because we hate black people, too. Everything white people don't like about black people really don't like about black people. There's some going on with black people right now. It's like a civil war going on with black people. And there's two sides. It's black people, and there's n***s. And n***s have got to go. Every time black people want to have a good time, ignorant ass it up.
What do you think, Don Lemon, 10 years ago, before you came down with the liberal pathogen?
Because black people, if you really want to fix the problem, here's just 5 things that you should think about doing.
5 things. I don't know if we have time for 5 things, but, just maybe 1 or 2.
Here's number 5. And if this doesn't apply to you, if you're not doing this, then it doesn't apply to you. I'm not talking about you. Here's number 5. Pull up your pants. Walking around with your ass and your underwear showing is not okay. In fact, it comes from prison when they take away belts from the prisoner so that they can't make a weapon. Respect where you live. Start small by not dropping trash, littering in your own communities. I've lived in several predominantly white neighborhoods in my life. I rarely, if ever, witness people littering. I live in Harlem now. It's an historically black neighborhood. Every single day I see adults and children dropping their trash on the ground when a garbage can is just feet away. Just being honest here.
Dare I say it, but the old Don Lemon from 10 years ago actually sounded like a real American. Meanwhile, Fox News launched their own version of BET called Fox Soul. And this is a 3-year-old network now, an almost 3-year-old network. And it gets a little confusing because some people think that this is owned by Disney because Disney did buy a bunch of intellectual property assets from the 20th Century Fox Corporation. But this is not one of them. This is owned by Fox Corporation, which is controlled by Rupert Murdoch, along with Fox News. So just think about this. This is the sister station to Fox News.
In Dumb Cracker News, let me get into this.
Dumb Cracker News.
A recent episode of Real Coffee with Scott Adams podcast, pro-Trump Dilbert creator Scott Adams told white people to get the hell away from black people.
Oh, why would he say that?
First and foremost, we don't need your help. That's the first thing, right?
You mean you don't want us to pay you reparations anymore? Fantastic. Thank you.
Miss me with the white savior complex. And part 2, you're being flippant and think you're being funny, but quite honestly,
No, I'm being serious. Like, we're not going to pay you a dime.
I actually agree with you. I actually think majority of y'all, especially the ones that think like you, should actually stay the hell away from black people. You'd actually be doing us a favor.
So he is literally agreeing with Scott Adams, whose entire career is now completely canceled. But this guy will continue to have a job on Fox's BET, Fox Soul. Of course, it would take a 24-hour news network just to cover the endless anti-whiteism examples that are spewing out in America every day now. Like this one from the New York Times. Can my children be friends with white people? Or Issa Rae, the creator of an HBO series, who at the Emmys a couple years ago was asked who she was rooting for to win, and she said, black people.
Who are you rooting for tonight?
I'm rooting for everybody black. I am. Betting on black tonight.
And here she is at the Emmys 5 years later, where she was asked again, this time by a transgender host for extra diversity, who she's rooting for this time.
Fabulously and iconically 5 years ago here at the Emmys, you told us that you were rooting for everybody black. Tonight, Issa Rae, who are you rooting for?
Everybody black. Nothing has changed. It will never change.
Of course, if a white actor or actress, writer or producer were to say such a thing, they would be kicked out of the Emmys. It would be overshadowing the entire event. Their career would be over within an hour. All of their movies would be pulled from the streaming services, and they would literally never work another day in their life. Are you a BIPOC, a Black, Indigenous, or person of color who is tired of the anti-whiteism in America today? Then you may be interested in my new I Love White People shirt, available from my online store at markdice.com, or click the link in the description below. In other news, did you hear that the FBI also just quietly confirmed that the coronavirus leaked from the lab in Wuhan, China was man-made? So also have a new shirt to celebrate that the conspiracy theorists were right. So head on over to markdice.com or click the link in the description below and check them out.